You may be ahead of your time. Readers may not have caught up to where you are in your thinking about the necessity for rigor balanced with these stories. I'm actually thinking as you're talking that I have an opportunity on this platform, on this podcast, to ensure that historical accuracy, or at least even historical facts, are disseminated to the public. And I'm thinking there may be some listeners or some viewers who don't even know about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And it would probably be helpful to give an overview of that, especially in light of a lot of denial of this type of history.
Right. At first, I want to speak to the first part of what you said, because as you know, I've been writing this blog for 14 years. It's in high school now. And, the responsibility we have as public historians is so, so real. And what makes it almost harder is that there's no one looking over us, advising us, and telling us, you have to be more rigorous there, you have to be more rigorous there. So we have to be constantly checking and double checking ourselves because we're taking memory into our hands. And while it may seem like, oh, please, it's a blog, it's a podcast, it is a really big deal. People respect, I think, it when academics do try to talk to them and they take what we say seriously. So, I'm with you. Even if the rigor may not, they not might be ready for it in book form, we still don't really have a choice. It's our responsibility. Now, as for what the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is the most famous instance of Jewish resistance against the Nazis during the Holocaust. And I'd say in public memory, it's been very commodified by Hollywood on one hand and Israeli state building on the other. Um, and there aren't even enough movies about it for it to be totally Hollywoodified. But generally, what's been trickled down through public memory has been a version of the uprising where it's being fought by very young, brave, tragic men who are throwing Molotov cocktails, and sometimes there are women who are their girlfriends or mothers or whoever in the background. Um, that's even reflected in the art made about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. For those who have visited the site of the former Warsaw Ghetto, there is a monument there made by I just forgot his name. One moment. I'm just going to look that up. Nathaniel Rappaport. And on it, it portrays the ghetto fighters as almost biblical heroes, like strong, muscular, and masculine. And at the center of it is Mordechai Anielewicz, who was the main commander of the Jewish Fighting Organization, which was the underground group which planned and fought the uprising. And he was a hero. He should be in those monuments. That's not the issue. The issue is that there's only one female figure in that monument, and that's a breastfeeding mother who's sort of looking away from the viewer. And now there were breastfeeding mothers in the Warsaw Ghetto during the uprising, and their story is an important one to tell. But they were not the only women involved in the fighting and planning of the uprising itself. In fact, Sivia Lubetkin was the only female commander of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And right before it began, she was sitting with Mordechai Anielewicz and comforting him as he had a complete meltdown. And I don't blame him for having a meltdown and panicking. I would have panicked too. But she was there next to him doing emotional labor for him, cooking his meals, cleaning his clothing, doing gendered labor while being the only female commander, and she's nowhere to be seen in any of this art. Now, I briefly mentioned Israeli state building, and now that's a hornet's nest I really don't want to step on. But, post Eichmann trial, which is post 1961, a lot of their state building has been built around the idea of these beautiful, strong young people carrying out a brave last stand for the Zionist cause. And, these were very young, some of them were very beautiful young people, but they weren't fighting for Zionism or as Zionists. We had Zionists among them. We also had communist, socialist, Bundists, anti-Zionists. The Polish Jewish ideological spectrum between the two world wars was absolutely massive. So we had representations of all various schools of modern Jewish politics represented in that uprising. Moreover, I wouldn't argue that it was a tragic last stand, because that's usually how it's understood. And I know why it's understood as such, because the Nazis put it down and burned the entire ghetto. But if you look at the writings of some of the fighters and the leaders, what they all make very clear is that they were not fighting with any desire to, or any pretensions towards defeating the Nazis or liberating Warsaw or ending the Holocaust. Their purpose in fighting was to restore the dignity of the Jewish people, to make a stand for history, to understand that there were Jews who fought back. There was no real, they were not people who just went silently and quickly and passively to the slaughter. And in that sense, they actually won because they forced the Germans to treat them as equals on the battlefield. On the first day of that uprising, the Jewish fire and Jewish resistance was so unexpected and so well organized that the Germans had to retreat and come back with backup troops and tanks and bigger, scarier guns. And in the end, they realized they couldn't actually defeat the Jews on their own turf, so they resorted to burning the ghetto. So, if the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was fought to force the Germans to acknowledge them as equals and humans on the battlefield, which some would argue that it was, you could argue that it succeeded. So that's also not understood. But again, there is this real cinematic Les Miserables-esque quality to these beautiful young people on the barricades with guns who die overnight. And that's certainly present, but that's not the entire story.
How do the stories of the women um, give us collectively, but certainly give the readers of the book, a better understanding of what the resistance movement was about and what the actual events of the uprising um, were about and the eventual outcome?